But as we mentioned, President-elect Trump has now chosen a banker for Treasury Secretary. Steve Mnuchin joined CNBC this morning in an interview and talked about the way that banks are regulated under a law called Dodd-Frank. Candidate Trump said he wanted to dismantle those regulations. And here's what Mnuchin had to say today.
As we look at Dodd-Frank, the number one problem with Dodd-Frank is it's way too complicated and it cuts back lending. So we want to strip back parts of Dodd-Frank that prevent banks from lending, and that'll be the number one priority on the regulatory side.
Joining me now is the Frank of the Dodd-Frank law. Former Congressman Barney Frank served as chair of the House Financial Services Committee during the financial crisis. He helped write that bill. Congressman, nice to see you.
Thank you.
What happens if they do what he just said, if they strip back parts of those regulations?
Well, they're very unclear about what they're going to strip back. You know, Donald Trump is in a difficult transition for him now from the rhetoric of his campaign to the reality. Of course, the very fact that he has now appointed a Mr. Mnuchin, who was an advocate of cutting back regulation on, among others, his former employer, Goldman Sachs, and Mr. Ross, a hedge fund guy who's done a lot of trading. This is probably the greatest bait and switch since Trump University, in the sense that he promised people he was going to be tough on Wall Street and he was going to help the working guy. And in fact, he is Wall Street's best gift in many, many years. The stock market has gone up. The segment of the stock market that's gone up more than any other are financial institutions. So it depends on what he wants to cut back. Now, in terms of restricting lending, the only provision in the bill that actually restricts lending is the one that says you can no longer lend money for home mortgages to people who can't pay it back. We had this problem where, thanks to this process called securitization, where lenders made loans and then sold the right to repay, so they didn't do much scrutiny of the ability to repay. And that was the single biggest cause of this crisis, all these bad mortgage loans. So we said, essentially, we replaced that market discipline that comes when the lender just sells off the loan and says you cannot make these loans, these subprime loans to very low-income people who can't pay it back. Well, that's the only thing that actually restricts lending. So I don't know whether they plan to cut that back. I thought they agreed.
The incoming administration talks, though, about provisions that make it, red tape, essentially, that make it harder for banks to give out so many loans and make it hard for small businesses to get loans, is what they would say.
They say that in general, but you will notice they never tell you what provisions. I deny that there are any such provisions other than the one I talked about. Now, I do think for smaller banks under $10 billion, I've supported since 2013 a provision to exempt them from things like the Volcker Rule. In fact, it doesn't apply to them. I do agree. They have had their lawyers tell them to spend too much time and energy dealing with that. And I've also believed that banks that had $50 billion in assets, we put that at the level at which you got the extra scrutiny. I think that was too low. So I would support changes.
You support some amount of change to your own legislation.
That's what I was in the process of saying.
Sorry, go ahead.
But I want to be very clear. Here's the problem. The largest institutions who want to get rid of the restrictions on derivatives, on these razzle-dazzle trades, it said in the New York Times today that traders are especially happy with Mr. Mnuchin. I am afraid that they plan to take the legitimate concerns of the smallest banks and use them as a kind of a battering ram to get rid of the bigger issue. So I want to know what specifically they're talking about. Now, one of the major things we did was to put regulation on derivatives, on these very complex instruments that are traded back and forth. AIG was allowed to get $170 billion in debt beyond what it could pay off. They went to the Bush administration and said, please help us. The Bush administration felt it had to respond and pay off $170 billion of its debts and keep them in business. Now, we have several things in the law that say that can't happen again. So once again, when they tell me that there are provisions that prevent lending, I don't know what they mean. I'm afraid that they're going to use the legitimate needs of lending, which I don't think we've cut back, to cut back on these things like derivatives and other complex instruments that really enhance Wall Street's profits more than real business.
Can I ask you, you're watching from the outside now, this entire election, and I wonder your thoughts about the Democratic Party right now. President Obama did an interview with Rolling Stone. He was kind of musing about how Democrats lost the election. He said that working class families haven't been neglected, but that Democrats' policy proposals, quote, are not heard by the folks in these communities. What they hear is Obama or Hillary are trying to take away their guns, or they disrespect you. Those are the words of the president. Do you agree? Do you think you've just not communicated well?
There's an element of that. There's an element of that. Part of the problem, though, is being in power. Look, I think Donald Trump's going to find this. There are certain inherent problems that are there in the world that are hard to deal with, and I think being in power, we get blamed for them. I also think that there's a great irony here. Donald Trump's getting a lot of support in the financial community because they think he's going to spend a lot of money on infrastructure. Basically, that he's going to run up the deficit. They don't seem to care about that much anymore, and do a lot of fiscal stimulus. That's the headlines. Well, the irony is that when Barack Obama and the Democrats in Congress wanted to do similar levels of fiscal stimulus, we were frustrated by a filibuster in the Senate. So part of the irony is that, yeah, there were policies that the Democrats were pushing for that the Republicans blocked. And Donald Trump has now become the advocate of these. So, but I do think that President Obama made a mistake himself in that regard by continuing to push, as the most visible Democrat, a further major trade bill long after it was clear that that was a symbol as well as a reality of people's anger.
You're talking about the
I think you now have a Democratic, but let's do remember when you talk about losses, Hillary Clinton got well over 2 million more votes than Donald Trump. This is an odd kind of loss. It's thanks to James Madison and the Electoral College, which I wish we could change. So a majority of the country voted against Donald Trump heavily, and more voted by millions for Hillary Clinton than for him. Having said that, I think what you now have a clear path for the Democrats to spend a lot of energy on actually providing the kind of federal economic policies that will stimulate jobs. And here's the key, and Donald Trump may help us with this. It's to pull back from this notion that America has to be worldwide the maintainer of order and cut back on the military. Trump puzzles me here. He does say America is bearing too much of the burden, and I agree with him on this, but he then wants to increase military spending. The great advantage of not bearing a burden beyond what we can and must do would be to cut the military. So I think going forward, if the Democrats say, let's cut the military substantially back to what we really think we need to do, and put that into increasing Medicare and putting people to work in infrastructure, then I think you're going to see a very different electoral result next time.
Former Congressman Barney Frank, always so interesting to have you with us. Thanks so much.
Welcome.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.